So welcome to the last brown bag of our July month, celebrating the anniversary of the Historical Society. And today, we're very lucky to have a guest speaker, Robert Austin from the State Board of Education. He's the social studies coordinator there. He does amazing work, and he's here to tell us about the new social studies core standards, which were underway for a number of years and have been passed and are being implemented this year. And I think this is information that will be useful to the people who work in these agencies, so I was really glad that he could come. I wanted to talk just briefly at the outset about this interesting ongoing relationship between the Historical Society, the Division of State History, and Utah history in the schools, because as Kevin was researching in the board meeting minutes from the late 1960s, he came across a really interesting discussion in 1969 when the director of state history learned that the public schools were thinking of revamping the social studies curriculum standards, and we're going to orient them towards geography and current issues. And as more information came in, it looked like they were going to de-emphasize Utah studies in the schools. And this created a lot of concern in the Historical Society and among the board. And there was a lot of discussion about what the role of the Historical Society might be in education, promoting Utah history in the schools in Utah. So Dr. Abrams was quoted as saying that he felt it was the society's responsibility to place Utah history where it belongs because he felt that Utah history was still going to be taught and that the materials should be provided for it. And then Dr. Brimhall stated that it seemed to him that the basic problem is the right to indoctrinate the youth, that the battle is not only in history, but any other course that deals with the cultural patterns of the group. So we all know that history has always been political, but this is just another example. And what the board was talking about doing at this time was starting like a junior historian's publication that would be designed for 7th grade readers. It would be published out from the aegis of the Historical Society. And we don't know if that ever happened. We could do some research and find out. But it's an interesting episode. So with that really brief introduction, I'm going to turn the time over to Robert, and then we'll go from there.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. So thank you. I'm Robert Austin. I'm the K-12 Social Studies Specialist at the State Board. I taught Utah Studies for about 10 years in Salt Lake City School District before I came to the State Board of Education. Delighted that anyone, I'm the Maytag repairman of social studies specialists. It's always nice to come out and see actual other humans who want to hang out and talk about what I think is really the reason we have public education, is to provide social studies and to have students be thinking about the issues of the day. I love the fact that in 1969, they were really thinking about how teachers of Utah history should be provided with stimulating and authentic materials from which to teach. One of our biggest challenges in social studies education is that it really is the most fascinating, most amazing topic of study, and yet for many students, the classroom practices and the classroom work really doesn't reflect how exciting it can be. So we have some real challenges to face. What I can tell you is that we have new standards. Now, I want to tell you right away, I want to make sure I clarify, I taught English as well. I know history really isn't a verb. It's a noun, but our point here is it really is all about the verbs, and it really is all about doing history. And between the work we want students to be engaged in their history classes, in their social studies classes, and also the kinds of work that is so central to the work of Wendy's work in Utah History Day, we have some real opportunities to celebrate the doing of history. So I'm really delighted to be able to be here to kind of, in some ways, celebrate the collaboration that is occurring across the division, from the Division of State History and with the State Board of Education regarding effective social studies education, and in particular Utah studies. So we have brand new standards that were adopted unanimously in December 2016, which was a holiday miracle. And those standards specifically talk about a line of secondary courses that we offer in the course of study for most students. So 7th grade is Utah Studies, 8th grade is U.S. History 1, which pretty much encapsulates American history up to right around the Civil War and Reconstruction. Then we've got world history, we have world geography. The challenge there is a lot of those courses are a half year, so students get all of world history in half a year. And if they're absent for a day, they may have missed 3 empires and a couple revolutions. We have world geography that is sometimes a full year, but sometimes also a half year. U.S. History 2, which is post-Reconstruction, and focuses and tries to actually get students to learn that there was a president after Grover Cleveland. So we don't have a teacher at the end of the school year trying to say, hey, we won World War II, as they're heading out the door. So we have U.S. History 2. And then we have a U.S. Government and Citizenship course, which is required for and recommended for seniors in high school. The idea of preparing them for all the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. So we have new standards, new and improved, right? Check this out, the diamond shreddies. They used to be shreddies, but now they're diamond shreddies. See the old boring ones and now the new ones, right? So we have a lot of folks who would say, all right, well, so what? Great, you have new standards. Meh, I always wondered how that was spelled, now I know, right? But there are some really significant changes that we've focused on in these standards. And a lot of it is really tied to the craft of history and the craft of what it is that historians actually do. I have a writer who was a professor from BYU who served on the writing team with me who would work with 5th graders, and he asked 5th graders, what is it that historians do? And the 5th graders thought about it for a while. You just put your heads in the mindset of a 10-year-old and think about what they would say in terms of what historians do. Any guesses? What do you think they would say? Historians, what do historians do? Yeah?
Track dates.
Yeah, they track dates, right? Historians read books, as far as the 10-year-olds were concerned. They attended lectures. They studied dinosaurs, because there was some confusion there about exactly what historians did. They also read a lot of Wikipedia articles, and they watched a lot of documentaries. That's what 10-year-olds thought historians did. And it's probably not that much of a change from what a lot of high school students think about history instruction. So what I can tell you is that we've really tried to focus on new and improved ways of helping remind students what it is that good history work involves. So to start with, we've put and simplified the standards into strands and standards. That's simple. Strands, standards. Strand, in this case, in social studies for the most part, in history courses, is all organized around periods of time. So chronology, and all of our history courses are chronologically based. It doesn't mean you can't teach thematically and across vast stretches of time, but we also want students to understand chronology and understand causation and how events correlate across the globe and across time periods. So in Utah studies, there's a much more of an emphasis on specific historical periods in Utah history rather than kind of a thematic approach, which was the case before, with some specific strands that focus on really their lives from 2002 to the present, so that students really understand that they have a stake in the game. They've got skin in the game in terms of history, in their own history. So we also have the other piece of that is standards. And the important line here to look at in this second sentence is that a standard is an articulation of the demonstrated proficiency to be obtained. That we're really trying to think about what is it that we want students, in terms of their proficiency, what do we want them to demonstrate? We have a lot of standards in the past that would say things like, students will understand the importance of. It's like, well, how do you demonstrate your proficiency at understanding something? I mean, are the kids kind of nodding? Thoughtfully understanding, right? That doesn't help. It doesn't help us articulate what it is that we want students to be able to do. It doesn't help them know that they know stuff. We know that students will feel successful and feel like they have self-esteem more by actually being good at things rather than us telling them how great they are. So we want students to really leave Utah History Day going, look at this demonstration of what I was able to do. So we have a focus on demonstrations of proficiency. Then there's something else that's critical and that's new and that is never before seen, at least as far as I know, in standards documents. And that's, we've included questions, possible guiding questions to consider. All learning is predicated on trying to figure out answers to questions. When kids are 4 or 5 years old, they've got a million questions. We want them to consider and ask really significant, fascinating, compelling questions. So we have possible guiding questions to consider. We've clearly laid out the idea here that this is just a possibility. These are just recommendations. You do not, as a classroom teacher, have to do this. But we hope that they will understand the central role that questions play in any kind of inquiry. And so that's those are some of the examples from some of the standards that we have. We also have very specific instructional expectations. History is very often considered as a passive subject where students are empty vessels. We're going to pour in the information. They're going to regurgitate it back. Kids get bored to death by that kind of instruction. They love social studies and history instruction in the elementary grades. But by and large, many students by the high school level report that they don't like history. And what we hear are adults saying, oh, I love history. Hated it in high school, but love it now. So what can we do to fix that? That's why we really wanted to try to drive standards that try to rethink history as an engaging process. So we've tried to do some specific things. We focused on relevance. The standards writing committee said, we need you to think about how do you make social studies instruction relevant for kids. So here's a Utah Studies standard. So you can see the UT, which is the Utah, standard 2.8. So in strand 2, 2.8, it asks this. Students will explain how their own connection to Utah is a reflection of the complex history of the state. It doesn't matter whether your family arrived here 10,000 years ago, in 1847, or last week. You have a role to play in the story of this state, and you can answer and do that standard. And we want students to understand that they are a part of the story of this state. All of them. It's incredibly important. We want cognitive rigor. We expect a lot out of students. So think about this. This is a standard for 7th graders. Here's what we're asking them to do. They're going to use data regarding the key components of Utah's economy to make recommendations for sustainable development. There are a lot of adults who can't do that. But we think 7th graders with the right information and the right resources can do these kinds of things, can start thinking about water, can start thinking about land use, can start thinking about, well, what are the basic sectors of the economy? Now, our old standards said students will be able to identify the diverse ways people make a living in Utah. And you could pretty much do that with a matching little worksheet. We don't want that. We want students to be able to think about, well, how do we grow jobs? What should we do? What are the best ways to continue to have Utah being a wonderful place for families, a wonderful place for business, a wonderful place for tourists, a wonderful place for outdoor retailers, a wonderful place for miners. There's no wrong answer to this question either. If you're in Price and you want to talk about coal mining, great. If you want to talk about in Moab about mountain biking, great. We want to focus on demonstrations of that cognitive rigor or the doing of social studies. So in this case, this is a US History 1, so this is 8th graders. They're going to use historic case studies and current events. So again, trying to focus on relevance and trying to continue to focus back in on their own lives to trace how and explain why the rights, liberties, and responsibilities of citizens have changed over time. Men in 1920 didn't just wake up one day and say, you know, I think women should be able to vote. That's not how it happened. Whites didn't just suddenly say, you know, let's let everybody sit in the hotel and let's let everybody go to these restaurants. Something happened, and students need to be able to understand those causal relationships, to be able to see those shifts and how that promise of America has been changed and expanded and redefined and continues to be redefined. We want a real focus on the real-life application of disciplinary thinking. We want students to be thinking about not only their historical thinking, but also geographic reasoning, economic reasoning, political science reasoning. This is a geography standard. Students will use geographic reasoning to propose actions that mitigate or solve issues, such as natural disasters, pollution, climate change, habitat loss. Geographers do not walk home at the end of the day from work and tell their spouse, oh man, my hand is so sore. I was coloring maps all day. That's not what geographers do. We shouldn't have kids in geography class spending their day coloring maps, when what geographers really do is they look at real life issues and they say, you know, if we planted more wetlands, we would probably mitigate the impact of the hurricanes. You know, if we mapped out the fault lines, we could figure out which cities are going to be most likely to deal with earthquakes, and we could mitigate that by having some retrofitting of school buildings. Geographers do this every day, and so we want to make sure that students understand that. It's exciting, it's fascinating. We also have in every single course a focus on civic preparation, this expectation that this is really what we're all about. And what I'd like you to do is a lot of text up there. I know, this is like a PowerPoint. I'm breaking the rule for PowerPoints. But what I want you to do is I want you to find just a phrase that resonates with you. And I'm going to ask you, a few of you, just to throw out just 3 words, something that you think, yep, that's important. That is what we're about in public education.
I noticed the progress of our communities, et cetera, rests upon the preparation of young people to collaboratively and deliberately address problems, and then to defend their own rights and the rights of others, and to balance personal interests with the common good, which seems to be not something that is in the current political discourse right now.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else, something that spoke to them? A line you liked? Yeah.
Well, I would say I think more and more people are getting involved in defending their own rights, the rights of others during this political climate.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
It strikes me that it's absolutely right that the social studies classroom is the place to have these conversations and do some learning about how to disagree and still act civilly toward other people. How to balance those interests.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we kind of, go ahead, please.
Oh, I just agree with what Wendy says altogether. As I was reading this, I was thinking I taught community college in Vegas, and I'm just seeing people's faces as they would think through topics and talk about them and learn about them. Social studies are just so vital to learn about what's happened and to figure out, well, how do we deal with stuff now?
Right.
So
the reality is that students actually love engaging in this process. And it's rare. It needs to happen more often. I can tell you that I've asked juniors and seniors in high school who are competing for some amazing scholarships and are incredibly civically engaged, who come every year to a roundtable discussion that we have about current events as a way to kind of see what they know and how they can articulate those views in a civil way. And when I talk with them about their day, which I jokingly refer to as American Idol for nerds, because it's this competition for the United States Senate Youth Program, they tell us how rare it is, that even those students don't really have the kinds of opportunities to have these conversations. If they don't practice those skills now, when they're young and when it's low risk, then when there's more at stake, including their vote, for example, it can cause a real problem. So,
Yeah, can I
please.
interject? As a grad student, I was teaching Intro to American Government, and the inability for students to critically analyze a topic was very apparent.
Mm-hmm.
So having them start this where it is low risk, where they can explore topics and explore the whys and the whats, they're more prepared in college to be able to do that in writing because they can think it through.
Right.
And that was a big hurdle they just couldn't overcome. And so then they default and blame me that I'm biased.
Right, right.
You just don't like my opinion. And so I'm heartened to see more focus on getting them to think.
Yeah, and
interact in that.
part of our challenge is to encourage these kinds of opportunities. So to have civil dialogue, to think about problems, to look at solutions, to think about the impact of current events, and then couch it within the framework of historical reasoning and being able to understand historical events through those issues as well. But we don't expect history class to become just a current events class. That's not the point. But the point is for students to be able to understand the relevance and the connection, and to be able to have those kinds of really amazing conversations and disagreements that are our birthright of winning the geographic lottery of being in the United States. And we squander that when we don't practice those kinds of opportunities. Yeah.
Can you go back one?
Sure.
And I don't mean to derail or
Yeah.
anything, but growing up in Provo 50 years ago, I don't recall ever thinking or being told that school was a locus for encouraging civil engagement, or that schools had a civic mission. And is this new? How new is this? Or was I just not thinking?
Yeah. It's probably funny. There was a really interesting course called The Problem of Democracy. And it was a central part of the school curriculum in the 1915, 1920 era. That there was a real focus during the progressive era for schools to really have kids grapple with and think about what is their civic responsibility and the civic mission of schools. Now, the civic mission of schools in that larger sense, it's probably, I would say, I mean, it's kind of funny because as you get older, you're like, oh, it was probably 10 years ago. And then you're like, oh, it was actually 30 years ago, right? But it has literally been probably 25 or 30 years of a focus on what is the central civic mission that schools can play in helping prepare students. Yep. Yeah.
That's a wonderful goal that I think we need to aspire to, but what you referred to in the early 20th century had to do with fear, xenophobia and anxiety about immigrant groups and making sure that they...
And Americanizing and, right, yeah.
So those periods, although they were engaged towards a more sinister end.
Right, right. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's the public education, if you don't think that public education is a political beast, then you're not reading the papers, right?
Well, you can see that even just in the language of the standards.
Sure. Absolutely, absolutely. Yep. We also have a real focus on the future in these standards. Here's a U.S. History 2 standard that says Students will use evidence from recent events and historical precedents to make a case for the most significant opportunities the country will have in the future. We want students to also not lose that optimism about what the future can hold and what role they can play. In world history, we have a standard where students will identify a pressing global problem and select the most promising political, technological, medical, or scientific advances being created to address those problems. We want students to see that there is hope, especially kids. I mean, kids need to know that they're the ones who are great at thinking outside the box. We want to make sure they think outside the box, down the street, around the corner. And that's what we hope we can do with these standards, is to focus on that. So what does this look like in practice? Well, in Utah's studies, the first standard right out of the box, students will make evidence-based inferences about the complex ancient cultures in Utah after studying artifacts from the prehistoric era. So in terms of history, and in terms of thinking about history, we want students to really understand that artifacts, traces, really can tell us a lot, and can tell us a lot about complexity. It's a lot of conversation. I can still tell people talking about a woman wanted me to use a book in a classroom, and it talked about how people were on a wagon train and they left civilization, and they didn't see civilization again until they got someplace else. I'm like, well, I think the people in the middle here would probably differ with you about civilizing and what that definition of what a complex culture is. And so what I can tell you is that there are still ways to embed the kind of civic engagement goals, even with this first standard, when you think about the current issues around artifacts and around ancient cultures in this state. One of the first things that we're dealing with that's in the news all the time, of course, is Bears Ears, right? So one of the ways that a classroom teacher might think about the Bears Ears monument and all of the language and discussion around it is to practice the kinds of things that we've talked about regarding civility. So think about how would a classroom create some kind of consensus document that would really look at and focus on the best use, the best way to move forward with this conversation around a monument. So these are ideas that can promulgate both an understanding of those ancient cultures, but also connect to current issues in a way that helps kids demystify what the heck the papers are talking about. There's a lot of background here that if you don't get it, you don't get it. Variety, the newspaper Variety, okay? Variety is a newspaper devoted to whom? Do you know? Does anybody know? It's a showbiz. It's a showbiz newspaper. And the showbiz newspaper in October 1929 said, Wall Street lays an egg. Okay? Well, it's a showbiz paper. So what's laying an egg in the showbiz world? It's a dud, right? Open and closed. Bam. Right? Well, now, if you know 1929, something happened on Wall Street in 1929, right? So Wall Street laid an egg. But there's so much there that you don't understand. If you were just reading that, you'd be like, what the heck are they talking about? Variety newspaper, what? So we have to help students kind of dig through and understand all the complexities around these issues. I tell people that teaching is easy if you don't know how. Right? It's a cinch if you think it's read the chapter, answer the questions. But it gets very complicated when you start thinking about more complex ways. So these are the old standards on the left. You can kind of see the differences. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you'll see the changes in terms of pushing the cognitive rigor and of demonstrations of proficiency and of trying to see how it is that we can help students expand their reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills in a real way, in a way that prepares them for their lifetime career. And their lifetime career will not be, I'm not talking about their job, I'm talking about their lifetime career as a participant in their community, as a citizen of this country, as a part of this neighborhood, as a part of this culture, as a part, wherever they live, they needed to develop these skills. We need them whether they go to college or not. About 64% of the workforce doesn't need a bachelor's degree. And who knows what life will be like in the future about whether you need a college diploma to do work in this whatever this new economy is, but you still need these kinds of skills. You absolutely need these kinds of skills. So we want kids to read and think like a historian. Yeah?
Go back to that last slide.
Sure.
And then the fourth one on the bottom.
Yeah.
Use primary and secondary sources.
Right.
I haven't really seen the use of primary sources.
Sure. Yeah, there's a real emphasis on trying to help students understand and dig into primary sources. And I'll tell you what, Utah History Day does an amazing job of using primary sources. When you've got, you don't just have Rosa Parks there, you've got Rosa Parks' fingerprint card and a diagram of where she was sitting on the bus. You've got all these primary sources. Now sometimes it's not a panacea, it's not a perfect, but it's an amazing resource that we need to continue to develop.
Having been a History Day judge and asking about primary sources, well, those are the ones I use most.
Yeah, and I think that the sophistication of kids has changed a lot. You'd be surprised, and when you come back to judge, you're going to see that, because Wendy's already been recruiting. So anybody else who wants to judge History Day, it's a blast. Reading and thinking like a historian, when you think about in terms of the traditional classroom and the reconceptualized classroom, in the kinds of ways that we want to encourage the implementation of these standards, we're talking about that in the old traditional classroom, the role of a text was to convey information. Here's the truth, thunk, especially the 42-pound textbook, right? Instead of students being able to start thinking about, well, how do I learn from this text and how do I even critique the text itself? What are the ways that we can think about doing social studies, for example, with the role of students, skillfully weighing evidence, developing their own interpretation. When students in the 5th grade classroom were talking about what a historian did, that one of the things that Jeff Noakes would talk about with those students afterwards was he said, okay, well, let's imagine this. Now this would never happen in your class or in your school because you guys are always great, but let's say there was a fight in the classroom or in the cafeteria. And now there's a fight in the cafeteria and we think there were 2 kids involved and the principal wants to know what happened. Who's the principal going to talk to figure it out? What's he going to start doing? So the principal, he or she, is going to then go talk to students, talk to the custodian who was there, talk to another teacher who was there, find out that both of those students, they may even talk to the parents because the parents might actually know that when they had a conversation the night before, Dad had said, you know what, if Billy smarts off to you again, you just sock him in the mouth. Well, that's probably important information to know, right? But what happened is that the students, those 5th graders, as they started thinking about the fight in the cafeteria, they started realizing that then the created history of what it was that happened depended on those sources and depended on who it was that you asked and where they were standing and their vantage point. And they were able to use that as a touchstone metaphor throughout their history study to be able to say, now wait a minute, this is kind of like that fight in the cafeteria. So Custer's Last Stand or the Bear River Massacre, or that all depends on where you stand. And that was a critical insight that those 5th graders had that every kid ought to be able to get. In terms of the evidence, we want kids to think about all the ways that they learn about history and all the kinds of things that we can learn, including specific primary sources and accounts and historians' interpretations, but also the traces of things. You can learn a lot from digging up garbage piles, right? From the old privies that we find on a map, and we can find out that if you go to Parowan and you use that plat map and you can figure out where the outhouse was and you start digging, it's amazing the kinds of stuff you can find. So one of the amazing things is that we live in a golden age of resources, incredible age of resources. And it's really the information age, right? But the challenge is it's also a slippery slope towards the misinformation age. And that's another critical piece of why we want students to be able to develop these skills. Students have got to be able to understand and analyze resources and texts and think about the veracity of the information that they're getting. Take a look at this. This came across my Facebook feed. What do you, just looking at it graphically, does this look brand new or old? It looks old, and we can tell it looks old based primarily by the font. Isn't that interesting? I mean, we just don't see that font anymore. It's probably harder to read. It's harder for some people to make it out. So here's coal consumption affecting climate. And the furnaces of the world are now burning about 2 billion, right, tons of coal a year. It adds about 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere yearly. This tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the Earth and to raise its temperature. The effect may be considerable in a few centuries. I saw this, and I was like, oh, wow, that's fascinating. And I immediately forwarded it on, shared it with my friends on Facebook. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute. Remember the quote from Abraham Lincoln? Don't believe everything you read on the internet. Wise words. I think Frederick Douglass also had something to say about that. I'm not sure. Wise words. The challenge here is you put a photograph, you put anything online, it becomes viral, it becomes incredible. And fake news, in particular, is actually a commerce. There are people who make money off of creating the most absurd fake news. It used to be that The Onion only did that, and it was just for fun. But so students have to understand that, well, you see this, and you're like, well, it looks old, but I don't know. Maybe this isn't really old. Maybe it's just somebody's font. So you have to teach them about things like going to places like Snopes. You know, Snopes isn't the only place to go. There are lots of other ways to triangulate the data. But what you come across when you go to Snopes, I like to use Snopes a lot for when my mother sends me the, do you know they're going to start taxing emails? I'm like, who's they? And Mom, come on. So then I would send her back, you know, the Snopes. But in this case, this actually was a primary source, a clip from 1912. There's actually a guy who's been doing research to try to find what are the earliest mentions of the effects of climate change occurring to kind of countervail this like Chinese hoax story, or to countervail the people who want to somehow deny the science. So students need to know and have these skills. Okay? Educators really have to help students learn these skills. Parents have to help teach these skills. Sam Weinberg, who works with the Stanford History Education Group, has done some research that says most kids, when they see a website, they cannot figure out whether it's fake or not. If it looks legit, if it looks pretty good, it's got some footnotes, it's truth. And we've got to help develop that skill set with students. And we have to think about it in terms of mortal danger. Here's kind of a funny response, subtle clues that it was all a big hoax found after 40 years, right? I had students who would walk into my classroom when I taught 7th grade who said, did you know we didn't go to the moon? I'm like, what? Because they'd seen the documentary the night before on television, and now they can just watch it on YouTube, that this is all some giant hoax. And if you start doing the math, you start thinking about all the people who would have to be in on it in order for it to be a hoax, including the families, apparently, of the astronauts who died on the launching pad in 1967. You want to tell those families that that was a hoax? But it's a very slippery slope from here to, you know, that whole Hitler thing, 6 million Jews, come on. It's a big deal. It's critical. And it's really fundamentally what we're about when we think about the standards that we're trying to create for social studies and for students. They really do the kinds of historical inquiry that help them sort out and sift and make sense of the world. History and the other social studies prepare students for a richer, fuller life. It's so much more fun to be able to stand in front of the state capitol and know architecturally why it's interesting, to know the story of the architect, to know the story of the sacrifice that was put into building that. It's so much more interesting to go to the Lincoln Memorial and to stand there and know that Marian Anderson sang there in 1939, that Martin Luther King spoke there in 1963, that Abraham Lincoln, that second inaugural address was pretty stunning. To know that Forrest Gump stood right there on that, right? That's what makes life richer, more interesting. It nurtures their imaginations. We want kids to be creative and think outside the box. And we want them to become better thinkers. And doing history, doing social studies, using these kinds of standards is, we hope, one of the ways that we can get there. Now, one of the great things that all of this does, aside from us being more human, is it allows us a chance to collaborate. And at this point, I'm going to turn over to an amazing colleague of mine who's actually helping kids learn how to take these standards and put them into practice. Wendy, our gift from Colorado. It's been a pleasure to work with her over the years with Utah History Day. So I'll turn it over to Wendy and then we'll just visit afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. I'm not going to talk an awfully long time, but let's see. But it has been wonderful over the last 4 years after the National History Day program moved into the Division of State History under the most frightening of circumstances. Truly, it had been shuttered. And Robert was one of the people who helped come to the rescue. And the collaboration that we've developed over this time, I think, has been really productive on both ends for both agencies. But National History Day is a program that started in 1974. It's been operating continuously in Utah since 1980. And it really is about doing history. It's about getting kids out of those boring textbooks where they really do not remember, what was on the worksheet from last week, and digging in deeply into something that interests them. So a lot of you in my division are pretty familiar with History Day because I've lassoed you into it, but I'm wondering if folks from archives and from some of the other areas have been involved in the program at all, or if it's completely unknown to you. Glenn's been involved. This is a program that is available to teachers who teach from 4th to 12th grade. They can employ it in almost any year of the curriculum that they're teaching. And the goal is really to get students to do an in-depth research project and to let them become the historians. And it's very much in line with the way the new social studies standards have been reconfigured, because it involves active engagement with doing history, not just with receiving history. So we do require all of the students to work with primary sources as part of their research. We do expect them to be able to read secondary literature and use that to help them understand the primary sources that they're finding. So it's in-depth, and it involves critical thinking and a lot more analysis than the old drill and regurgitate method. So one of the things that makes this magical for kids is the element of choice, because they can choose a topic that is of merit and that interests them, that matters to them. We aren't assigning everybody to do a project on the War of 1812. We would lose them. Okay? So we see a big variety in topics and a lot of choice. This year we saw, with our theme this last year, which was about taking a stand, we saw many, many, many students engage with World War II resistance. Like unknown people who I had never heard of many of them who did something amazing during that war, and kids are really able to identify with that. The other thing that makes it work really well for them, there is a lot of choice with how they present their work at the end of the research process. So we do ask them to draw conclusions based on the research that they do. We don't want them to draw their parents' conclusions. We want them to draw their own conclusions and then create a presentation that is logical and that has pulls on their own unique creativity. So we offer a variety of categories for them to work in. We have performances. This girl did a project this year on Temple Grandin. Actually, it was on Temple Grandin's mother and how difficult it was for her to, her struggle against the establishment in dealing with her autistic child. She was being strongly encouraged to institutionalize her girl, and she refused to do that, and she was one of the first parents who did so. We have students who can make documentary films. I shared this one out the year that it was done. This was really a wonderful history of the Long Walk of the Navajo, done by 3 girls from Montezuma Creek. That project went to nationals and did very well there, and you can see it on our website. Kids can do websites. Now this website won an award at the national contest 2 years ago. This is about a microbiologist from Utah State University who implemented incredible changes in public health dealing with communicable disease. And so that's an example of a local history topic with really broad implications. And then exhibits, which is kind of what you usually think of with a History Day project. The girl on the side there exhibited her project this year. She did it on the Ballet Russe, and it's taking a stand against traditionalism in dance. And she was able to display her board at the Smithsonian for a day. So if you are interested at all in working with these fine young people, I am always looking for judges every single year. And but I think what is important to take away from today is that there is really a change in the way history is being presented to our youth. And it is a much more engaged and active approach to teaching and learning history. So, does anybody have any additional questions for Robert or for me?
I do. I have to say, my face is sore from smiling, thinking about you two and your programs, really. This makes me so excited for my children. Is there any evidence that teachers are changing the way they teach, or is it just yeah, these people are giving me more stuff?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like when I said teaching is easy if you don't know how,
Yeah.
for one. The other thing is change is hard.
Yeah.
You can tell me my entire life that I need to floss my teeth, and and I might even buy floss, and I might even hang it in my mirror. That doesn't necessarily mean that we make that change. And so, one of the things that's really exciting, for example, about Utah History Day is you have students give testimonials about how much they love history because of that work. So what nothing persuades teachers more about changing practice than seeing really positive, successful examples of that change. So that's where we're going to really have to work to provide teachers with the proof. And that means developing together resources. Think about it, for example, the Utah Studies example of students who want to talk about sustainable development and how they're going to, what are the recommendations for the economy for Utah. A teacher can look at that and go, that's great, but I've got 43 students every class period in my room, and I don't have time to find resources to address that. But that's where all of us can help. That's where all of us can think, you know what? Oh, we've got some great examples here on that specific topic. Or here's a case study that could be really useful. Or, and so that's why being able to work with Jedediah, to be able to work with the websites and the resources and state history, and to be able to think about helping make that shift. I do think that teachers didn't get into this gig because they didn't like kids, because they didn't want to make a difference. And so what the biggest challenge in social studies and in history instruction in particular is it's one of the few disciplines where there's the widest disconnect between actual practitioners and what happens in the classroom. So if you think about it, in mathematics, kids are doing math. And in cooking class, they're making cupcakes. And in PE, they're running around the block. And in history class, they're not doing history. Not in the ways that we want them to. And so that's the shift that we have to start thinking about. How is it that we engage students in the geography, the history, the economic thinking? It's going to require a long haul of changing practice. And a lot of teachers will tell me, I know that this is what I should be doing. I just don't really quite know how yet. I don't know how to manage that. And that's going to take a lot of professional development, a lot of professional learning. Yep, sure.
Are those kind of resources coming, are they beginning to emerge, I guess?
Yeah.
Are they showing up?
So one of the things that we did this summer, working with classroom teachers, we had a big institute and kind of spent a couple days on this information, but also giving teachers time to start collaborating with one another. And then we created this giant spreadsheet. And right now it's just a huge spreadsheet of just teachers putting everything in that they've found that they think is great with their recommendations. And you can search it and, we'll vet that. I mean, we really are in a place where we're trying to be to a point where we can kind of be a concierge. If you think about it, when you go to a hotel and you want to know what are the best restaurants, they don't give you a list of 1,000. They give you a list of 10. So we really want to work with people around the state to be able to create some really outstanding examples of the kinds of approaches we want students to take. Yeah, Brad.
I was wondering if you would talk about some of the things we've been hoping to do in state history related to the standings.
Sure.
Okay, so as we have met with Robert regularly over the last few years, he's communicated how badly needed our resources will be to teachers who are all of a sudden being required to work with primary sources in their classrooms. And I don't think you can exaggerate the number of teachers who are really frightened about having that new task because it's different. It's different from what they've done. So we are working on creating a set of resources for teachers who are specifically doing Utah studies that will feature primary sources from our collections that have been digitized and provide enough materials in the packet for each topic that a teacher can quite easily take that into their classroom with enough background on whatever the topic is, and then enough primary sources for kids to actually be able to engage with them and figure it out from what those documents or images are telling them. We're very excited that we've been able to get started on that project after a lot of years of just talking about that project.
Yeah. Ironically, it does in a way, in that you have teachers who are so reluctant sometimes to talk about religion because they don't want to seem to be proselytizing, right? And we have to constantly remind people, both, and that's why within the standards, both within Utah Studies and within world history, for example, you cannot understand history and human history without understanding the central role that religion has played in so many people's lives, and in such kind of causal relationships and drivers of expansion or empire or sacrifice. So it does pose challenges. It always has. We constantly have to provide, and I think that's where I think collaborations will be really important, to be able to help teachers understand, for one, there's a diverse religious story in Utah, but that Mormon history is an essential aspect of that history. And it's an interesting challenge. It's very similar in science when teachers know that the standard says you should teach about evolution, but they're still frightened about all of the kinds of ramifications that might come from it. So, yeah. All right. This is called wait time. You wait about 3 or 4 seconds. It seems like an eternity, but that's what you do in education. Any other questions? I really do appreciate the invitation. I'm excited about our work together, and I'm more excited about what kids will do with these standards. So here's to them. So thank you.